Hello chap here, welcome to another Mad Minute with the rolling block rifle. Now some of you will say, hang on a minute, you've already done it. Well, it wasn't me, it was one of our subscribers, Ormund, all the way from Norway, who did it with his Swedish rolling block, and he very kindly allowed us to share his attempt. But now I have my very own. This is the so-called Egyptian model used by the French during the franco-prussian war, and of course now I've got my own, I want to give it a try. Now, for those of you who are only interested in the shooting, that's no problem at all. Just head to about 2/3 along. I'll put the timestamp in the video and just enjoy the shooting. For those who want to stick around, what I want to do is give you a very, very potted, condensed history of the integration of the rolling block the first time as a French military firearm in the 1870-71 war. So, this all starts with the fall of Metz and the defeat at Sedan, right at the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War. There, a large amount of troops were captured and capitulated, so all of their rifles were gone, and also all the reserves that were, of course, placed close to the front were also captured due to the rapid advance, and also the imperial factory of Münzig was also then in occupied territory. The three remaining imperial arsenals, so Saint-Étienne, Châtellerault and Tulle, couldn't by themselves reconstruct the whole national arsenal. So the newly formed government for national defence, they had to find a source of firearms, and that was essentially abroad. So they sent out buyers all over the place, and they needed to quickly get vast amounts of weapons to equip the army that was due to be recalled due to general mobilisation. Of course, the United States was uniquely placed to provide a vast amount of firearms, so France quickly went there. Now, these were firearms either purchased directly from the manufacturers or through arms dealers. Now, the rolling block was actually already, well, the armaments commissions were already quite familiar with the rolling block, because as soon as the 1st of June 1866, the rolling block was proposed to the armament commissions, in particular for adoption as a cavalry firearm, and it was too late to consider it for the infantry. The program for the chassepot had been started, the arsenals were tooling up, so there's no going back on that. But for the cavalry, maybe. You have to remember, of course, that Napoleon III was extremely interested in any advancement in firearms, and after considering the rolling block, he went off and went, oh, shiny, with the Vetterli, so he could have ended up with Vetterli carbines. So yeah, at the time of the national emergency, the performance and the ease of handling of the rolling block was already very well appreciated. As it happens, the cavalry ended up with chassepot carbines. This was actually more a sensible decision due to simple logistics. So, with all this in mind, it's hardly surprising that when they really needed rifles fast, amongst many others, the French government raced to Remington. So in this potted history, we're just going to be talking about the infantry rifles, because there are also carbines, various models of them, that were also imported at the time. But that's another story. So just considering the rifles alone, there were 5, 6, depending on how you want to count, different models that were imported. So we're going to start with the most common one, which is what we have here, the so-called Egyptian contract. Now, Egypt signed a contract on June 30th, 1869 for 60,000 rifles, and production of these rifles was supervised, or was going to be supervised directly at Remington by none other than Colonel Minier. He was then military advisor to Egypt, so he's going to be sent there as a quality control officer. And as with many governments at the time, Egypt had some financial difficulties, and it made it rather difficult for them to pay for their contract. Now, despite this, Remington actually continued to produce the rifles despite not being paid. Some of them they held as stock, and a considerable amount they sold on to external dealers. So, due to the inability to pay for these rifles, when France came along and said, "Can we take over your contract, and then you can order your rifles later?" they said, "Yeah, sure, no problem." And so that's what happened. So the contract with France was signed on the 17th of September 1870, and it stipulated essentially the delivery of everything that Remington had in stock, which was 1,200 rifles, and then an order for a further 50,000 rifles. Now, this was the first of many contracts, and when we add all the contracts together, you get approximately 150,000 rifles. Now, the definitive number is actually quite difficult to determine because on top of the ones provided by Remington, France also bought all the ones that were available through arms traders. So the caliber is 11.43 by 50 R. It's 1 meter 28 centimeters long. The finish is generally white. I'll say generally, and it generally has a bayonet fitting for a Saber bayonet, but not always. We'll get to that later. The next model we're going to talk about is the Spanish model. This is nothing to do with the Reformado. This is the original Spanish contract, which was for 10,000 rifles, which was destined to troops that were stationed in Cuba. And these were to be delivered between June 1868 and May 1869. And France somehow managed to obtain 1,200 of these directly from Remington, and about 2,500 directly from various US arms dealers. In fact, most of the ones that were available through the arms dealers were ones that had been rejected by Spanish inspectors. Now, the Spanish rifle is normally a little bit longer than the Egyptian. It's 1 meter 35 centimeters. Caliber is 11.15 by 57 R, or 43 Spanish. And the finish is generally blued, not always, and it's normally fitted with a socket bayonet, so it just fits on the front sight. I say not always because a lot of the ones that were sold on to the arms traders tended to have little variations in finish, different bayonet options available, so it's sometimes quite difficult to tell what model you actually have. So imagine what that would have been for the logistics during the war. Next up, we have the Greek contract. Now, this was a contract initially for 30,000 rifles, which was proposed, not signed, proposed in 1868. And then the Greeks had some financial problems. So the government reduced the order down to 15,000 rifles, which there the contract was formally signed in May of 1870. The caliber then was chosen, was the 11mm Albini, or Comblain, so the Belgian 11mm caliber. So the contract is signed, great. There's a one teensy-weensy problem though, and that is that there is an agreement between France and Remington that says that all production of firearms between September 1870 and April 1871 is exclusively reserved to France. So that means that they can't continue producing the Greek contract. So there's some intense negotiation and no doubt some copiously greased palms. The Greeks also, like the Egyptians, agreed to postpone the delivery of their rifles by a year. And this allows the French to acquire the Greek rifles. And these are essentially identical to the Egyptian model. The small number that were produced prior to this takeover of the contracts were, of course, chambered for the 11mm Albini Comblain caliber, but that's a little bit smaller than the Egyptian, so they just reamed out the chambers. And all the ones produced after that were straight up produced in 11mm Egyptian. So those, you really can't tell the difference between that and between the Egyptian and the Greek contract. There are also two straight US models that were imported. The first one is a batch of 15,000 rifles chambered for a 58 Burden. Now these were rifles that were put together using or recycling percussion rifle barrels. And the second one is the Remington Springfield 1870 Navy rifle, which was chambered in 50-70. In September of 1870, the US Navy wants to order 10,000 rifles. Remington is unavailable due to this reserved production with France, so production is therefore proposed to Springfield. Even so, Remington would really like to sell those 10,000 rifles to France. They got a good thing going here, got to milk the cow. Problem is, how do they get the US Navy to reject them without the US Navy losing face or being accused of compromising the nation's defense? So what ends up happening is some political wrangling, and there's some scam concocted in which they are outraged that the rear sight has been mounted ever so slightly in the wrong place, and this is totally unacceptable, and they're going to reject the whole batch and they want to renegotiate the contract. So in all this political fracas, a very flimsy political diversion, Remington discreetly acquires these Springfield rifles and sells them on to France. By the way, when they reached France, they were never issued. So at the end of the war, they were just sold off. And the last pattern I want to mention is the Papal rifles. Now, it's a small batch, but it's a quite interesting story. So France acquires these 300 license-built Nagant rolling blocks, which were initially destined for Rome, but they are seized during transit through France after the fall of Rome on the 20th of September 1870. So these rifles are chambered for 12.7 by 54R, 45R, so yet another caliber. They are put into service, despite only being 300 and with a different caliber, but they're only sensibly put into service in one unit. So while it is said that variety is the very spice of life, for military logistics, it's obviously an absolute nightmare. So if we're talking about the rolling block rifles alone, we have 5 different calibers going around. In addition, the 2 major ones, the Spanish and the Egyptian models, can look visually identical. They chamber similar but not interchangeable cartridges. So you can imagine how much fun that must have been. And we're not even talking about what's going on with the carbines. All right, now let's see my performance in the bad minute. And this time I'm even equipped with a proper period-ish cartridge pouch just a couple of years later. This is a Gras model 1877 cartridge pouch, which I found here. And yeah, it's excellent quality. So let's go. All right, so 9 shots. I just need 1 or 2 seconds to get that 10th one off. And I'm sure if I hadn't yeeted that cartridge for the first reload across the range, I probably would have pulled it off. Our friend Ormond managed it, so it is possible. Now, the extractor on this is the first sliding linear extractor. But as you can see, with a little bit of practice, you can actually work it so that the case extracts completely. And I wouldn't say ejects, it sort of slides out rather than having to help it out with your hand. Now, although the adoption of the rolling block was somewhat rushed, of course, at the time, there was a provisional pamphlet that was produced, just like for any of the other genuinely adopted, officially adopted rifles. And this contains nomenclature, manual of arms, and all the information for maintenance. Now, there's a link in the description down below if you want to read more about that. Now, before I leave you, I've got one more anecdote which concerns these magnificent Saber bayonets for the Egyptian model. Now, these rifles that were being delivered by Remington, of course, had to be delivered with a bayonet. You can't have a French infantryman without a bayonet. It's unheard of. And originally, the production was outsourced to Prussia, to Alex Koppel, Gebruder Weiersberg, and W.R. Kirschbaum in Solingen, a very, very historic cutler's city. And why were these 3 manufacturers selected? Well, actually, they'd already been producing chassepot bayonets. This was before the war, so there's no problem. So these bayonets will be produced there, sent to the US, either directly or via the United Kingdom, and there Remington would fit them to the rifles and number them. Now, of course, due to Egypt's financial problems, the Prussian firms delay production, so they don't make very many. And of course, once war were declared with France, Prussia cancels the contract. Perfectly natural. This leaves Remington a bit of a bother because they have absolutely no intention of producing the bayonets themselves. So when the contract is taken over due to these financial problems and the logistic chain, they only have 2,700 bayonets to deliver with the rifles. So all Remington can do is promise that at least 40% of the rifles will be delivered with a bayonet. For this, they distribute contracts all over Europe, including returning sneakily to a few Prussian manufacturers. And the remaining 60%, that's going to be the Government of National Defence's problem, and they just turn to the internal cutlery industry or any metalworking factories within France. So for my rifle, it is a Prussian-made Gebrüder Wehrberg bayonet. It is absolutely not numbered. It didn't come with the rifle. Nonetheless, it fits perfectly without the slightest play. And just a bit of ASMR that clicks in there. Note that the bayonet mount for the rolling block is slightly different to the one on the chassepot. On the chassepot, we have an additional flange, which requires 2 chamfers in the groove of the grip, and this flange is absent on the rolling block, so the grip slot on the rolling block bayonet is just straight. So here we are at the end of this show and tell, very cunningly disguised as a Mad Minute video. Nonetheless, I hope it was vaguely interesting, the way that the rolling block was adopted by the French hastily in the Franco-Prussian War. Let's not forget that this is only the first time it is adopted by the French. Then they have the updated model in World War I, this time in 8mm Lebel. Unfortunately, I haven't found a really nice one of those, but I'll find one someday. So, just leaves me to thank you for your attention, thank you for your support, and whatever platform you're following us on, whether it be YouTube, don't forget also that we are on the app. So, yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you out there maybe in the frighteningly cold, snowy ranges, or here in a nice warm workshop. Bye!